brain freeze. Book 1 of the Regeneration Trilogy by Taurie L. Humbert. Dedication. In remembrance of Mom for knowing exactly which book to put in front of me to entice me into learning to love to read. Also to my baby brother for asking for one final promise to him, that I will step out of my comfort zone and take a risk, to jump off something so high it makes me pucker. This is my jump, Troy. I hope my chute opens before I hit the bottom. I miss you both so very much. To Jack for being my first and favorite horse. His intelligence and plucky spirit always kept me on my toes, or sitting on my butt in the middle of the road. I love that little jerk. Also to all of my wonderful students who have inspired the laughs, tears, and fears. Chapter 1. The Crash. February 20th. The Back Door. Nick Havill's life revolved around improving his grade point average, maintaining his place on the South Bend varsity soccer team, orchestra practice, and applying to the best colleges his parents could afford. He was the textbook example of a well-rounded student, and had managed to keep his GPA in the top 10 on the school roster throughout his high school career. This year, he was determined to place his GPA in the top 5 before graduation. But after hours of studying for today's AP chemistry test, he discovered that he had actually dropped 3 places. He stood in front of his locker, linked into the online roster, and scanned down the list of names. His name was now listed at number 12 on that roster. He had calculated that he should have been nearer to number 7, maybe number 6. Nick scanned the list again, noting that some of the names that had never placed in the top 20, let alone the top 10, had somehow now miraculously jumped into the top rankings. He concentrated on the list as he ground his teeth. Then abruptly, he plowed his fist into his locker. "Yo, Nick, what's wrong?" Jim asked. The 2 boys had met in the 1st grade and had been best friends ever since. While Nick had always helped Jim with his studies, it was Jim who kept Nick grounded to some kind of a normal childhood. "Nothing," Nick snarled at his best friend. As if to add emphasis that nothing was wrong, he kicked his locker. "I just studied my ass off for that AP Chem test, and 3 other students who've never placed in the top rankings just scored higher than me. I just dropped 3 places in the lineup." "Nick, you've got to relax before you blow a gasket." Jim tried to calm his friend down. "Listen, why don't you come to the game room with me and blow off some of that excess steam? I'll get you in as my guest. It really helps me relax and let go of some of the excess tension. This cutthroat scramble for first place freaks me out. If I didn't have an outlet, I think I'd explode." "I can't. I have to go home and study for that calculus test tomorrow." "Look, take 1 hour to relax, and I bet you'll study better later." Jim shrugged. "You won't be able to study like this anyway. At least take a walk with me to the game room. Have a look around and count to 10 a few times while we walk. My gran says it works for her." He laughed and playfully punched his friend in the shoulder. "Yeah, I need a breath of fresh air," Nick grumbled. A catty voice from across the hallway called, "Hey, Nick." The girl simpered at him. "How'd you do on that chemistry test?" Chelsea Heflin, as far back as he could remember, had gone out of her way to tease and mock him every chance she got. He glared at her. "Shove it, Chelsea," he snarled back. Nick could not stand the girl. "Ah, did someone score higher than Nicky Poo?" She flashed a stolen test pad from under her jacket. Nick stalked across the hall and glared at the test pad. "How did you get that?" She smiled maliciously. "I've got friends in low places, Nicky." She smirked, and then stepped closer and hissed, "If you weren't so busy trying to be better than everyone else, you might have friends who would do things for you too." She smirked at Jim. "So what? You stole a test pad and shared the test questions before the test. How many of you cheated?" Nick glared at her. "Shove it up your ass." He snarled and stalked off. "Come on, Jim. I need to get out of here." Nick knew he shouldn't let her get to him, but if he didn't leave now, he was afraid that he might plow his fist into her mocking face instead of his locker. He hated it when he let her get to him and felt his frustrated anger building to overload. Nick followed Jim blindly down the street, His stomach was still clenched into a knot because Chelsea had cheated him out of his hard-earned grade placement. He had not been paying attention to where they were going. When he finally looked up, they stood in front of the women's underwear shop. "What's this?" Nick looked at the storefront in confusion. "Just shut up and follow me," Jim said. "This game is not completely on the up and up, if you know what I mean." "Hey, I don't need to get into trouble on top of my grade point average tanking," Nick said. "I'll have enough to deal with explaining why I dropped 3 points to my parents." "Tanked? 3 points, Nick, really? If that's tanking, where does that put me?" "Thanks, buddy," Jim quipped. "Sorry," Nick apologized. "I didn't mean it that way. You know my parents. They'll flip when they see my GPA. Look, your GPA didn't drop, they cheated. Didn't you just score higher than you expected to on that test? The truth is, Chels got one of her slimy friends to jack that test pad so they could cheat on that test. Several of them needed to get their scores up or they'd be out of that class completely. Now that they're safe from being kicked out, they'll go back to their lazy-ass ways and you'll go right back up the roster on the next test. But for now, just follow me and relax. Then you can go home and study for the calculus test. All right?" Nick shoved his hands into his pockets and shivered. Not a single ray of sunlight penetrated the shade in front of the building, and the wind felt like it was slicing right through his winter coat. Suddenly, going inside to get warm sounded like a very good idea. "Yeah, whatever, let's go." Jim led the way down the alley to the back of the store and swiped a keycard. The door clicked open, and they walked down a set of stairs into a large, dimly lit room. The game stations were set up inside transparent halo bubbles, with flickering lights emanating from the game stations, crammed into every space around the room. A few of the stations were full of people linked in with their neural implants, their arms and legs twitching to some virtual action going on that only they could see. Nick could hear the muffled sounds of shouting from inside the enclosed halo bubbles. Nick followed Jim as he weaved around the bubbles. There were different sized bubbles depending on how many station seats were in each one. Nick could see the occupants moving and reacting to something. He could barely hear their muffled yells and laughter. Jim walked up to the person at the counter, who was intently working on a piece of equipment. "Hey, Todd, this is my friend. He's my guest today." "All right, just you two," the young man behind the counter mumbled without looking up. "Sign him in. Station 7 is a 2-seater and open." Todd stopped what he was doing long enough to reach over and select a link adapter. "Here's a guest link for your buddy." He went back to working on the writhing mass of wires and computer chips spread out on the counter. "And remember to log off when you're done," he growled over his shoulder as Jim and Nick walked away. Nick followed Jim, weaving around enclosed bubbles through the dimly lit room, weaving around station couches occupied by players oblivious to their passing. Jim walked up to a clear dome bubble, marked number 7, and opened the door. Nick could hear the whirring of the station computers booting up as he stepped inside. Jim shut the door, and the noise from outside the bubble vanished. Nick handed Jim the link adapter and the Halo headgear. "Here, connect this to your main link. It will get you into the game. You won't get all the options in the game as a guest, but you'll be able to get the basics," Jim said as he hopped over the armrest and nestled down into the cushioned seat and pointed to the seat next to him. "You take station seat number 2. I'll be the squad leader, and you can follow me. Don't worry about making noise. These bubbles are almost soundproof." Nick sat down in the seat that Jim had indicated and waited while his friend punched in a set of codes on the keypad on the arm of the chair. Nick plugged the adapter into his main link, then connected it to the station port. He was suddenly plunged into the middle of a battlefield. "Whoa!" He dropped to his knees as a bomb exploded off to his right. Nick looked around in confusion. This seemed so real. He scrambled forward into a pile of rubble, the roar of battle all around him. He looked around. He was kneeling, not sitting, in a battlefield. "Yo, Nick, over here," Jim called from Nick's left. Jim waved his arm for Nick to follow him. As Nick crouched down and ran toward the pile of rubble that Jim was using for cover, he was still adapting to his physical simulation of his body actually running, walking, or, in this case, crawling on his hands and knees as he scrambled to the pile of rubble that might have been a storefront at one time. Jim handed him a machine gun. "Here, you'll need this. You have to aim pretty accurately. It's not like those cheap arcade games where you just point and shoot. You gotta hit your target square on, or it won't count." Nick stared at his friend in horror. "This is what you do for fun?" "You're nuts," Nick yelled. Jim laughed. "Yep, gotta remember it's not real." Nick gawked at his friend. "It's feeling pretty real at the moment. Now what?" he yelled over the roar of artillery fire and military vehicles rumbling past their position. "Keep your eyes open for rogue scouts. There are 3 kinds. The regular humanoids, you only get 1 hit for taking those out. Then there are the robots. You'll earn 2 hits for one of those. But the big score comes if you can take out these genetically altered war neanderoids. Those monsters will earn you 3 hits, but you earn it? Those things are hard to kill." "How many points is a hit anyway?" Nick scanned the surrounding battle scene. Jim laughed. "A hit doesn't count as points. You earn points by how long you stay alive. A hit is a DD. That's a dopamine dump. The hit sort of gives you an energy boost, like an adrenaline rush, so you can keep going longer. The more hits, the more endurance, and the longer you stay alive." Jim searched his friend's face for any sign that his friend was going to quit the game. "Do you want to leave?" he asked calmly. Nick looked at his friend. This meant a lot to Jim. His friend had been trying to get him to come play this game for months now. "No, I'll stay. I nearly shit my pants when that explosion went off, though," he told his friend. Jim's face broke out in a big smile. "Yeah, the first time I played this game, I nearly shit myself, too. That's what's so cool. It seems so real. This will be a lot more fun with you here. So let's make our way up into the action. That's where we'll get the best opportunities to score hits." Jim took the lead, sprinting from one mangled building to another, with Nick still overwhelmed by the sensation that he was physically moving through this battlefield, trying to keep close on Jim's heels. Jim pointed toward his right. "See that brick wall? Let's make our way over there and make a stand." Jim took off at a run, heading straight for the smoldering building. Nick jumped up to follow his friend when suddenly something huge jumped out from behind a pile of splintered wood. Nick stopped in his tracks. What the hell was that thing? The monster's muscles bulged and rippled over its gray-green skin as it moved, and it was focused on Jim's back. "Jim, look out!" Nick screamed. But the thing stopped and turned to see who had yelled behind it. And then it was focused on Nick. Nick thought his bladder was going to let go as the thing glared at him. The ape-like face leered at him, showing its brown and yellow teeth in a rictus smile. Nick backed up, his stomach twisted, and he thought he was going to vomit. "It's not real, it's not real," he repeated to himself. But it sure looked real. What a horror. The beast started to stalk toward Nick, raising a serrated scimitar that had to be longer than Nick was tall. The ape-like monster started to jog straight at him, its smile stretching across its nightmare face. Nick's whole body was shaking, and he struggled to raise the machine gun. Taking aim, he fired straight at the monster's chest. He was frozen in place as the monster continued to run straight at him. Nick locked his finger on the trigger as tight as possible, emptying the entire clip into the thing's chest. The nightmare stumbled to a stop 1 or 2 steps away. It swayed in mid-step, trying to take one last step toward Nick. Its breathing was labored, and he could hear it gurgling as it toppled over in a heap. Nick stood, shaking all over. Then suddenly he was nearly knocked over as a rush of euphoria flooded through his body. Breathing deeply, he started to laugh. "Whoa, that was great," he looked at Jim. "What the hell was that?" Jim was suddenly there, pounding him on the back. "Holy shit, that was great. You just stood there and faced that thing down." Jim looked at his friend's face. "Oh, you just got a triple D, didn't you?" He laughed. "Great, isn't it?" Nick shivered. "Wow," he panted. "That's amazing," he smiled at his friend. "I think I get it. What now?" After an hour in the game room with Jim, Nick had gone home to study for the calculus test, which to his complete satisfaction, he aced the next day, restoring his class ranking back into the top 10. May 19th, Pine Ridge Research Center, Samantha Jorgensen was on her way back to the mountain and to her remote cabin where she was conducting observations of the desert tawny owl. The small sandy-colored raptor had been commonly known to be a desert-dwelling species, but in the last 6 to 8 years, numerous sightings had indicated that these little owls had shifted to a new habitat in some forested areas. Many species had perished since the mid to late 2000s due to changing habitats brought about by climate change. The battle to bring all of humanity around to reduce their carbon footprint had almost not happened soon enough to make a difference. The political arena sparred back and forth, one side agonizingly trying to explain dataset after dataset exhibiting the effects of man-made carbon pollution, while the carbon-polluting industrialists expounded their beliefs that man was too insignificant to affect an entire planet's environment. Meanwhile, massive die-out events continued to occur planet-wide, and global warming had increased to nearly non-reversible levels. Finally, citizens worldwide stood together to vote for science-based political groups who were able to take control of government arenas in enough countries to push through key legislation to change the world's energy dependency from fossil fuels to renewables. In 2011 and 2020, catastrophic events had shut down worldwide airline travel. The data collected during these two major events had indeed illustrated that man-made pollution did affect our planet's atmosphere. The measurable data recorded during these two shutdowns of the airline industry clearly demonstrated that not only did humankind pollute our planet, but we could clean up our mess. Humans could affect the global climate for good or bad. This undeniable validation drove the world's science-minded population to stand up and push for worldwide change. Sam had focused her research on the study of habitat alteration and the effects these changes had on an animal's ability to survive. As worldwide climates continued to settle, the ability of any species to successfully move into a new habitat provided a rare opportunity to research the resiliency of that species' phenotypic plasticity. The North American polar bear had not successfully adapted to the lost polar ice packs in the Arctic and was now nearly extinct. There were some hybridized polar grizzly bears sprinkled around northern Canada, but very few of the purebred North American polar bears remained alive in the wild. There was discussion of introducing some Siberian polar bears to the Canadian northern coast now that ice packs were starting to return from the pre-climate change cascade cycle. But zoologists were waiting for the latest population counts of the native polar bears before introducing their cousin species, in the hope that the few remaining bears in the wild and in zoos could successfully repopulate on their own. 2 years ago, Sam had returned to her alma mater from leading her first successful research project, connecting radical species habitat shifts to the continuous fluctuations of global climate change. The project had her posted to a remote location in northern Africa, where the Sahara was undergoing a climate change of a magnitude not seen in tens of thousands of years. As increased seasonal rain cycles were occurring in that vast desert, the resulting savanna habitat was encroaching further into what had been an arid region. Native desert species were faced with 3 options: adapt to the new habitat, migrate with the receding desert, or go extinct. Sam's research supported the belief that successful habitat change was, as feared, a very rare occurrence. The apparent successful habitat change of the desert tawny owl provided one more source of data on species adaptation. Not since Darwin's original research on evolution had so many varied opportunities to study ongoing evolutionary processes been available to field scientists. The rapid rate of climate change had affected many habitats worldwide, resulting in many species struggling to adapt. Several species mutations had been recorded, resulting in a new adaptation of those animals. Unfortunately, for every animal with genetic mutations that allowed that species to adapt, 4 other animal species had gone extinct. The desert tawny owl's adaptation was that the little owl had adapted new hunting methods for its food in a new environment. Sam made her monthly trip into Boston early that morning to present her findings to the head of the biology department at UMass Environmental Studies Extension. and then to the Director of Finance for Scientific Grants at Valtech International Conglomerate, where she had received an extension of her grant to continue her research of this new adaptation. She had presented her first proposal last year for a grant to study the small owls, and had been directed to the desk of Michael Jones, where her grant had been approved over dinner. Within a few months and multiple dinners, their relationship had escalated. She had felt uncomfortable about romancing with the agent responsible for managing her grant, but in all honesty, he was only a go-between. But the relationship, in her opinion, had failed to thrive. Her research kept her on site while Mike was in his office. He repeatedly nagged her about making a second attempt to have a CIR implanted, so they could become closer. She had not made a second attempt to get the implants since, during the first attempt, her tissue rejected the implants, and the reaction and a corresponding infection had almost killed her. The bottom line was that his lifestyle and hers were polar opposites. He craved the hustle and bustle of the city, and she craved the solitude of her remote research station. Sam loved her time in the mountains. She reveled in the quiet sounds, the whisper of the wind through the fir and spruce, and the soft dripping of a light drizzle sliding off the leaves and needles of the trees. She was happy to be back at her secluded camp for another month of watching the little family of owls. She hurried to get set into her blind on time. She needed to be in place before the birds began their nightly activity so she could record their behaviors. It had taken months to find a female that would accept the placement of her cameras near the nest and raise her fledglings in front of one-way glass. Then, just as she was set for the night, Mike would usually signal her on her earpiece to tell her all about his day. The office gossip, who did what to who, even his strategic actions that he believed would move him up the ladder very soon. She could only listen during her watch, and he knew he had a captive audience. However, due to her lack of verbal input and his love of hearing his own voice, he deluded himself into believing that she was enthralled. She quickly found she could care less about his manipulations at work or the office gossip, and thought if she let him talk himself out, he would start to take interest in her work. This was not the case, though. Whenever she had the chance to turn the topic to her interests, he would quickly negate the validity of her opinions as superficial and navigate the conversation back to his world. Sam had decided to break off this relationship. She had always found that the few men she had had short relationships with were too self-centered and time-consuming. Their constant need to be the center of her universe was the reason she had ended each relationship. Sam was a quiet, reclusive personality, and men mistook her quiet, observational listening as a signal of complete interest in their petty shit. The truth was, she could care less what made their world go round. She wondered at that last thought, asking herself, was it Mike who was selfish for his overwhelming sharing of his life and ideas? Or was she the one who was selfish for wanting to be left alone? Sam finally cut off her Bluetooth. She breathed a sigh of relief and settled in for another long night of observing the little owl family and recording data. Sam sighed. Tomorrow she'd break this off. Hours later at dawn, Sam stiffly, slowly, and very quietly backed out of the blind. After a night of sitting in the small space, the mornings were always a challenge, and the cold didn't help. Thank goodness it was spring, and the mornings were warming up. She had to wait until the little parent owls, Cleo and Caesar, settled down into their daytime routine before even considering trying to move. It had taken too many days of sneaking around to set up this blind to collect the data she felt sure would prove her hypothesis. The little owls were very elusive creatures, and this had been her fifth attempt to set up a blind to successfully get the video equipment placed without scaring off the research subjects. With most owls, the first egg laid was the first to hatch and the first to start growing. Zeus was the first to hatch and the biggest owlet. Next was Athena, and last was Perseus. She wasn't totally sure if the gender matched the names yet, but some adjustments could be made later. Her earpiece had not vibrated yet this morning, thank goodness. She wondered if Mike was pouting about her decision to take some time away from their relationship. He had argued that the whole point of her getting a CIR was to improve their communication so their relationship could grow, but she already found the partial link to him a strain. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to be linked so he could have constant access to her head. She was used to being alone, but more than that, she liked being alone. He could not understand her need to be isolated and quiet for prolonged periods. The rest of the world had become more and more dependent on their constant link to the internet and their mind-to-mind connections with their friends and family. She guessed the old adage was true: you don't miss what you've never had. It was not that she was antisocial, but she found her quiet time regenerated her inner self, or, as her Nez Perce great-grandmother would say, her inner spirit. She walked back down the needle-cushioned trail to the cabin, and on the way, stopped at the lean-to to give her small horse, Jack, his morning grain and hay. After she spent a few minutes rubbing his ear, right where he liked to be scratched, she checked his water, then went inside to eat and review her data from last night's observations before she got some well-earned sleep. May 20th, the tournament, South Bend. Nick and Jim hurried down the street to meet up with the rest of the squad. Jim laughed. "I've created a monster. I've been playing this game for over a year, and in 3 months you're a squad leader, and we're in the tournament. I never thought I'd ever be in a tournament. I practically had to beg you just to try this game, and now you're dragging me down here every day." "Well, you were right about one thing. I needed to unwind. But now I've put so much time into this tournament that my GPA has started to dip. As soon as this tournament is done, I have to get my GPA back up where it belongs." They waited in front of the coffee shop, the bright spring sun warming the street. Nick turned to Jim as they waited for the rest of the squad to arrive. "You're my second, remember that." "Yeah, thanks," Jim pointed down the street. "Here they come." Nick had started to visit the game room every day after school. After his second visit, he had signed up for a personal account. Then he dug into his savings to purchase the top-of-the-line gaming links for himself and Jim. As with everything else Nick did, he had excelled at this game. He had worked his way up the ranking to squad leader, recruited a squad, and then had talked them all into signing up for the upcoming tournament. The team spent hours preparing for the tournament, and Nick had drilled them until each member recognized every hand sign, and they had mastered every routine and weapon in their arsenal. His squad couldn't believe that he had only started playing 3 months ago. Some of them had been playing for several years. Nick had heard of the game. It was known to be extremely violent and not completely legal. It was just the sort of thing Nick had never been interested in doing. The whole thing was too far out of his comfort zone and his good boy Eagle Scout persona. He had never done anything risky, but once he started playing the game, he couldn't get enough. He told himself that he wasn't addicted. He just wanted to do something different before he went off to college. But after his friend Jim had repeatedly invited him to the game shop that the local gamers called the back door to play a few rounds of Urban Legends, he was hooked. Upon playing one game, he wanted more, and he spent every spare minute he could squeeze out of his strictly regimented day to log in and play the game. Not only had Nick spent every minute he could spare after school to go to the game room to practice, he had recently started to skip classes in preparation for this tournament. In the last couple of weeks, his grades had dropped significantly enough that his parents had been called into school concerning Nick skipping classes and those dropping grades. That's when Mr. and Mrs. Havill had found out that their son had become fascinated with an online game. Nick's father had flipped out. "You've been skipping school to sit in a game room playing some asinine war game. What's gotten into you?" his father had bellowed. Nick tried to explain, "My grades are still good, and my team and I are preparing for the upcoming tournament. Once the tournament is over, I'll put all of my attention back into school. I can pick up the few points that my GPA slipped on the finals. The tournament is next week, and finals are the week after. My team is relying on me, and I'm the squad leader." Needless to say, Nick's parents were not buying into any part of his gaming plans. So Nick had no other solution but to go behind his parents' backs. He carefully lined up all his ducks for today. His parents would be in business meetings all day. They would not have an open link for the school to notify them that Nick had been dismissed early due to illness until they were heading home. By that time, the tournament would be over, and he'd be back home in bed looking oh so pitiful and studying his notes when his parents arrived home. Duck 1 and 2 lined up. He was free and clear to miss today's classes. Duck number 3. His friend Liza had promised to share her notes, so he'd have those by the time he got back home. Now all he had to do was get to the game room for the tournament. Most of his team had always been able to skip an occasional class. Their parents weren't as anal as his, and they had planned for weeks to coordinate for today. If they could only place close to the top, they might even be in the running for the upcoming international event this summer. The team met at the coffee shop and ordered the largest Colombian dark roast on the menu with extra shots of espresso, then loaded up on the sugar to keep them going. With caffeine and sugar rushing through their veins, they arrived at the game room with several other squads. Everyone sat down at their assigned station, logged in, and waited to receive their assignment. Nick glanced at the clock. 9:25 a.m. Their task was to infiltrate an enemy town, take down the police and military facilities, then eliminate vital services and capture prisoners. Nick's team drew the antagonist role. They would have to defeat the local protagonist. Jim groaned. "I don't like being the bad guy." "Just remember what you are always telling me. None of this is real and it's all about strategy," Nick told him. "Besides, to learn to defeat a bad guy, you need to think like a bad guy. So just look at it from that point of view. We don't know what the next round will be, and we need to be ready for anything." Jim frowned. "Yeah, I guess. I've just never been comfortable with the violence that the bad guy role is always assigned. It's easier being the good guy." Nick looked around the control station, then up at the clock, 9:28 a.m. "All right, everyone. We've worked for this for weeks, and we're ready." Most of the group nodded enthusiastically. Jim looked up at the clock, 9:29 a.m., and nodded. "Okay, here we go." They all entered the game. Nick felt a jolt. Then he was spinning out of control. He thought he was going to be sick. Then everything went black. The crash, May 20th, 9 a.m., Boston. Valtech Corporation now sold more cerebral implants than any other tech company in the world, and Bryant Coleman was Valtech Corporation. His company's tentacles reached out to every country on the planet, and now he was the top producer of internal cerebral receivers and transmitters worldwide. Sales of his CIRs, catheter implant receivers, had just surpassed the sales of all his competitors combined. He prided himself on always being on the cutting edge of technology. He had recognized the importance of this technology early and quietly began securing companies that manufactured the individual components required to produce the implants. When the market opened up to the public, his company was poised to jump in front of the competition. His biotech facilities could produce the basic CIR devices with price tags that the majority of the public could afford. His products met all the medical specifications and performed as advertised. He was not the first CEO to find ways to cut corners to keep production costs down. That's just how you played the game. For Coleman, it was all about the game, and he made sure he was always in the winner's circle. He leaned back in his chair and admired his office. This was not just his central corporate office in Boston. This was his personal trophy room. The furniture and art often clashed. There seemed to be no coordination of color, style, or theme. But Coleman saw the theme he desired. He had handpicked each item himself as a trophy of each of his conquests. He made a point of getting to know the owners of each business he set out to procure. They often had some personal item they owned that marked their own rise to success. When the final hammer blow was delivered and he took possession of that company, he would collect that prized personal item as his own. He stretched in his chair upholstered with the hide of a rare 25-foot-long Nile crocodile, another corporate seizure trophy. He smirked as he looked around his office and admired each of his prizes. Most of the victories had been the results of vicious corporate takeovers, and he loved to flaunt his conquest to the world. Each trophy was the equivalent of some vanquished corporation's CEO's head. The antique credenza was a bit of a joke inspired by a stand-up comic from decades ago. The rare oriental rugs were from antiquated, oil-rich countries from around the world. He lounged in his very expensive custom-made suit and waited for the signal from his 3D holophone on his desk to notify him that his latest project to expand his vast empire was ready to begin. Coleman looked up to the holovision tuned into the daily news report. He glowered at the newscaster, focusing on the growing crowd of protesters outside his office building in the streets below. What were they protesting this week? Higher wages, better health care. Last week it was some environmental bullshit. He had his PR department give out a couple more grants to some tree-hugging bioscientists to document their study of this week's latest endangered species. Every time the hordes caught wind of his corporation's profit margin, one of these charity mobs came banging on his front door. He would find his inbox full of charitable requests for their latest brain farts to save something that was endangered. Shit, it's my company and my money. How is it that these civic lame-brain bandits can legally rob me? He stood up and walked over to stand at the window. As he glared down toward the streets below, he accessed his personal DCIR. His personal CIR came from his top-of-the-line models, with safer, dedicated backups and firewalls. He also had his DCIR modified to his own specifications. He had the best firewalls produced to protect him from any outside signals, with the mere flicker of a thought. He scanned through his favorites for the latest updates on the international stock reviews. His 3D holophone buzzed. Finally, the call he had been waiting for came through. "Everything is ready to go, sir. You will have full access to the target in 5 minutes." The message was relayed in the ever-so-polite, sing-song Indian-accented voice of Dr. Veer Gupta. Coleman walked back and sat down at his desk, rechecking that his personal DCIR was activated. He wanted to have direct access when the link opened, but he did not want to be a victim to his own greedy manipulations. All his plans were about to come together. Years of planning, the best internet hackers money could buy or blackmail. He would be able to directly control the world markets and manipulate investments, making and breaking companies without detection. "So, are you finally ready?" he growled at the image projection of Dr. Veer Gupta on his 3D phone. "We have a lot at stake here." He worked to maintain his patience with the researcher. Coleman was eager to tap into the network. He would have the power to manipulate the populace and influence sales. Mass mind manipulation like this had not been tried since the infantile attempts to influence people at the movie theaters. Then, the subliminal messages were spliced into old movie film reels, suggesting to the viewers that they needed or wanted to purchase something. Buy popcorn. Get a drink. You're hungry. You're thirsty. "All right then, here we go, Gup. Everything we have worked for is about to become reality," Coleman prompted Dr. Gupta. Dr. Veer Gupta hated it when Coleman called him Gup. There was no limit to the depths of this man's apathy for anyone else's feelings. Dr. Veer shook his head at the irony. He had sent his grant applications out to so many reputable research organizations, and the only reply he got back came from one of the most callous people in the world. Valtech Corporation was the only organization that had offered him a grant to complete his studies of implanting empathy through CIR receivers into the psyche of the young. Coleman leaned forward expectantly. He was so close to controlling international sales, and if his people had done their jobs, the hacking would go on completely undetected. He could tip the commercial scales not only to improve sales of his products, but if this worked, he would also be able to decrease the sales of competitive companies. He'd have to be careful. He couldn't completely squash the competition. He had to make things look as normal as possible. He planned to let his Bangladesh production line go under at a point when things started to look too good for his company. This would not look too suspicious since that product line was not selling that well anyway, and it would make a great tax write-off. But then he'd put on a good show of trying to save the only production plant that offered employment to the destitute population of the district. Dr. Veer tossed a glare at the 3D phone image in his lab in the sub-basement of Coleman Towers. What had Coleman said? Everything we have worked for. Veer reflected on the hours, days, and nights he had put into this project, and how Coleman's contribution had been a lab, and the money to make his work possible. Veer had endured months of this man's belittling, arrogance, and foul-mouthed tantrums. Veer had arrived at Valtech with his idea 3 years ago, but his goal was to help humanity, to stem the rising hostility among teens. For some unknown reason, teenagers were becoming increasingly hostile and brutally inhumane. The ferocious attacks by gangs and individuals were becoming a worldwide concern. No matter what the educational community, psychologists, civic groups, or law enforcement tried, the number of teens sinking into vicious depravity continued to increase. Some groups were proposing that the abhorrent behaviors seemed to start when children reached the age of implantation, approximately 14 to 15 years. At this age, their bodies and brains had reached a point when the cerebral catheter implantation procedure could begin. The pre-adolescent brain needed to reach the near-adult physical stage before full implantation could be administered. Toddlers could receive the very basic implants, which were no more than simple location monitors to connect to parents with a GPS app to keep track of small children. This process could be started at about 1 to 2 years and was no more traumatic than receiving their vaccinations. These were extremely simple procedures, often followed up with the first parental monitoring apps. As the child grew, more elaborate systems could be implanted. Parents would then have their own systems upgraded to monitor their child's web activities as they matured toward adulthood. But once the full implantation was achieved, anyone with even the cheapest CIR had instant internet access just a thought away. Veer looked over the readouts again. The signal was ready to be embedded into today's news about the latest Chicago movie star to drop into has-been status. The starlet's photo was followed by the headline, "Here today and gone tomorrow. Will this one-time beauty be floating in the lake tomorrow?" All Veer had to do was connect the link to that headline, and tomorrow's sales of Coleman's company line of tampons would increase by 20%. The plan was to increase sales enough to make a profit, but not enough to attract anyone's attention. The sales increase was planned to take place the same week that the new and improved product line was released. In truth, the product was basically the same, but just in case, a whole ounce of cheap synthetic cotton had been added. Coleman watched from his holodesk monitor. "Well, what are you waiting for?" he snarled. Veer shook his head. The man was always an arrogant ass. No concern for safety, he just didn't care. But it was Coleman who provided the grant that made it possible for Veer to continue to work toward his own goal. The continuation of that grant was contingent on Veer's program, demonstrating some practical application, such as improving Coleman's profit margin. Coleman constantly complained about the many redundant safety procedures Veer installed. The funds that Coleman had granted to Veer had him working on a tissue-thin budget. Coleman's only interest was in the monetary success the project could bring, whereas Veer wanted to perfect his program to save the children who had fallen into depravity. Check, check, check. Veer's favorite physics professor had told him, "You can never be too careful. The minute you think nothing will go wrong, it will. Remember, if you walk in a lab and it doesn't work, you've entered a physics class." He loved that old worn-out joke. Veer smiled as he remembered his days in that lab. He had found his calling with that lovable old man. But now, here he was working for the greediest mogul in the world. Coleman had promised that a percentage of the profits would go to funding Veer's empathy project to help the children. Veer's own nephew was in prison now for assault with a deadly weapon. Jimmy, his namesake, had been a gentle, sweet little boy and a violin prodigy. Veer could not believe that the angry, violent boy in prison was his nephew. All Veer could do was plod on. It might be too late for Jimmy, but not for the rest of the children out there. He might be able to save them from his nephew's fate. Veer finished his final check. Calculations correct. Amperage correct. The signal wavelength would ride just below the newscast signal and be completely undetectable. Sales for tampons would increase, and the children would get help soon. Please work so I can turn this project toward helping the children soon. All right, Mr. Coleman, the system is ready. Veer spoke loud enough for the inter-office holovid to pick up his voice clearly. I'm initiating the first bidirectional data stream transmission. Now. Coleman looked at the monitor readout at his desk and demanded, Well, is it working? Veer examined his system of monitors, and the signal was indeed piggybacking onto the newscast signal with no sign that it was there. He smiled and answered, Yes, Mr. Coleman, it is working. I will open the link and inject the program signal. By tomorrow, you should see the sales of your targeted product line rise by 20%. Veer paused. Full injection in dot. 3, 2, 1, now. The signal wrapped around the carrier wave. He paused. Just a few more seconds. Coleman chuckled greedily. Veer had guaranteed that they would be able to track the effects of this first experiment through the sales of the product. Women around the world would have their monthly cycles, but now they would purchase his product 20% more than their previous choices. Coleman listened to Dr. Veer on his desk holophone as the scientist continued his systems checklist. Everything is a go, sir. You will have access to the target in 10 seconds, Veer announced. Coleman stared at his chrono, 9:29 a.m. He sat poised over his keypad in preparation to make the connection. He wanted to have direct access when the link opened. All his plans were about to come together, months of planning, and now he'd be linked directly into the international exchange. He would be able to manipulate investments, making and breaking companies without detection. As soon as Veer deployed his damn program, Coleman would set him up in his own secure lab, where he could work on his little humanitarian project to his heart's content. Then his hand-picked people would put this program to real work. He waited, listening as Veer did that stupid countdown from 10 to 0, then his computer screen went blank. The embedded signal wave would lock on and fuse onto the newscast, riding along undetected. But instead of an insignificant ripple, Veer's empathy wave fused with a second undetected signal already riding the newscast, and the two waves joined, creating a constructive tsunami sine wave. The combined signals continued to build, overwhelming more waves and continuing to build into an overload that surged throughout the worldwide network. Dr. Veer had not considered the existence of another signal. A signal similar to his in design had already been covertly injected into the WWN. The two illegal signals were programmed to connect to another signal, and the result was that these two waves fused and blocked the rest of the WWN. One safety protocol after another in the system was overwhelmed and crashed. Then, system by system, the worldwide net rapidly shut down as the massive viral wave continued to build, linking, then fusing into more and more of the systems. Dr. Veer Gupta had not known of the second illegal signal already embedded in the WWN. When the two waves encountered each other, they joined and evolved. Then all basic services shut down instantaneously. The WWN went dark, except for one signal. That signal fused with Veer's signal to increase empathy, prompted the other signal to increase impulsive actions. Bryant Coleman waited. He glanced up at his desk chronometer. Veer said 10 seconds. Then he did a double take. The chronometer was stuck, and the seconds readout was not ticking off time. What the hell? Did it work, or what? Veer had finished the countdown, and now all Bryant Coleman could hear was complete silence. Coleman jabbed the communications button. Gup! Did it work? Silence was all the response he received. What the hell is that idiot doing? Coleman snarled into the empty room. Coleman stood up and crossed to his private elevator and punched his thumb on the keypad. When it didn't respond in a few seconds, he punched it repeatedly. His private elevator failed to respond. He stormed back to his desk and viciously jabbed the communications key to Veer's lab and shouted, Gup! I have a blank screen up here. Still, no response. Bryant Coleman clenched his jaws, clamping his teeth together so hard that it hurt. His breath was starting to come in harsh, deep pants as he started building up to one of his infamous raging tantrums. He scowled around the room, then stormed over to the hidden panel where the contractors had installed an emergency stairway. He jammed his thumb to the keypad on that panel, but this device also failed to respond to his command. He grasped the edge of the frame and pulled, trying to force the panel to slide open. Coleman kept himself in physical shape with his own personal trainer, and he was a well-muscled man. Despite his well-toned muscles, he could not budge the sliding panel. He began to panic at the thought of being trapped in his ultra-safe office. As he scanned around the room, his gaze lingered on the antique suit of armor complete with mace and broadsword. He stormed over to the desk again, violently stabbing the communications key. "Veer," he screamed. "Answer me, you son of a bitch. What the hell is going on?" His fury was met with more of that infuriating silence. Coleman's rage exploded, and he stormed across the room to the suit of armor, ripped the mace from the stand, and attacked the elevator door, smashing the surface repeatedly with the weapon. May 20th, 9:30 a.m., Pine Ridge Regional School. Nancy Jackson suddenly stopped in the middle of her lecture to her 6th grade students as a sharp pain sliced through her head. She winced as her hand involuntarily covered the area of pain. Funny, it felt just like she had eaten ice cream too fast. The pain eased off somewhat, almost as fast as it came, but that one spot was still throbbing dully. "Are you okay, Mrs. Jackson?" Anthony asked with genuine concern on his cute little round face. The 12-year-old boy had not started his growth spurt into adolescence yet, and still retained the cherub face of an elementary student. "Yes, AJ, I'm fine. I think my allergies are giving me a hard time. Thank you for asking, though. How are you doing with your project?" She stepped over to glance at the boy's computer screen, only to find it had gone blank. She looked around at the other students' stations, only to find that all the computer screens had gone blank. She wiped the dampness from her eyes that had sprung up from the sudden sharp headache and glanced around. The digital clock had gone blank as well. Great, she thought. Did the power go out? The solar panels were working and the lights were still on. Or have we finally just overwhelmed our old network? The school staff had complained over and over that the system needed an upgrade. The old system just could not handle the increased demands for the growing population. As the number of neural implants in the middle and high school wings grew, it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain online service for the increasing numbers of elementary students. More than once, the system had frozen in the middle of a lesson because the demand outpaced the network's ability to handle the load. They had been promised that the district would upgrade the system during the summer break, but that didn't help her now. She looked at her antique pendulum clock on the wall and noticed the time was 9:28. Her old clock was slow again. There were 24 minutes of class left before recess, and then she could go down to Cindy's office and get something to soften this headache a little bit. If the computers did not come back up, she would have to go to Plan B for the lesson. She picked up the handset and tried to call Linda in the main office, but even the handset was dead. She went to the classroom door and opened it to ask Diane in the room across the hallway if she knew what was going on. As she stepped into the hallway, she could hear the children shouting and cries of distress, which triggered that inner alarm in Nancy to rush across the hallway to Diane's room. She glanced back at her own children. She was never comfortable leaving them alone. She glanced up and down the hallway for another adult. No one. She dashed across the hallway and opened the door to Diane's room to find most of the children huddled to one side, while a few of the more intrepid children were standing around Diane, who was on the floor. Nancy quickly directed the huddled students to go to her room. Then she rushed over to the teacher lying on the floor. She checked Diane's pulse, and her heart rate seemed to be faster than normal, but Nancy wasn't sure. Diane's body was trembling. She lay on the floor, her body suspended in a position as if she had been walking across the room, then suddenly froze in mid-step and just fell over. It reminded Nancy of a store mannequin that had fallen over, posed to appear to be in a natural state of motion. She repeated her directions to the students, who appeared to be the braver of Diane's children, to help the others get to her room. She turned to one of the larger boys. "You're Mike, aren't you?" she asked. His eyes wide, he just nodded. Would you run to the main office and get Mrs. Jenkins to come help? Mike nodded once, and like a little trooper, stood straight and took off on his mission. Nancy loved this age group. They were so genuine with their emotions and so hungry to please. Whenever they grasped a new idea, she'd bask in their thrill of accomplishment. She called it the wow factor. Their little faces would light up when they learned something that surprised or amazed them. And they would look up at her with that, oh wow, look on their little faces. And she would feel so much pride for them. She also felt a bit of selfish pride in herself. But mostly she felt lucky that she was the one to be there at that moment of revelation. Nancy bent over Diane and took her hand. Diane's hand and body were stiff, and she was completely unresponsive. Nancy could still feel a trembling vibration running through the woman's body, as if she were having a seizure. Nancy spoke to the prone woman, her friend for 6 years, and reassured her that help was on the way. Mike came running back into the room, but now that little brave face projected terror. Mrs. Jackson, the ladies in the office are like Mrs. Hanson. They aren't moving either. It's really creepy, like they all turned into zombies or something. Mike paused to take a shaky breath. Mrs. Jackson, something else is going on in the other classrooms too. The little kids are yelling and crying. Mrs. Jackson, what's happening? Mike's shaky voice was rising, and she could see he was on the brink of breaking into complete panic. She glanced one last time at Diane, stood, and quickly crossed the room to the frightened child. Show me. She reached out and took Mike's hand and led him out into the hallway. She hadn't noticed the sounds of children in panic, but now the cries of frightened children reverberated down the long hallway. Her students stood staring out the door of her room, looking out at her with fear and concern on their faces. Stay there, she told all of them as she let go of Mike's hand and quickly jogged to the next room. As she opened the door, she was met with the same scene she had just witnessed in Diane's room. She quickly instructed those children to go into her room. Nancy dashed across the hallway to the next 5th grade room, only to have the scene repeated. What the hell is going on? She looked down the hallway to the lower grades, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st, and the kindergarten rooms. She felt panic grip her. She could hear the cries of the frightened children issuing from all of those rooms. Nancy turned to see some of her students were now standing in the hallway. Sarah, Allie, and Hank, get all the coloring supplies and paper out of the back cupboard and take the materials to the cafeteria. Joe, Jeff, Sarah, Noah, and Larry, come with me. The rest of you help the others gather the materials and go to the cafeteria. She looked at the children she had called into the hallway with her and started to the next room. She opened the 4th grade room to see crying children, then ushered them into the hallway and told them to follow Larry to the cafeteria. She repeated this process at each of the next rooms, trying to hurry to get to the youngest children as fast as she could. At each room, she gathered the terrified children and sent them off to the cafeteria with one of the older children. She turned to see that more of her students had followed her down the hallway to offer their help. Noah, Mary, could you get out the milk and cookies and serve the kindergarten children first? Sure, Mrs. Jackson, no problem. The two took off at a run for the cafeteria. With the last of the classrooms emptied into the cafeteria, she ran to the office to find help. Just as Mike had reported, all the secretaries and the school principal, Mrs. Jenkins, were in that same frozen seizure state as her fellow teachers. Nancy grabbed the office phone, but again, just like her own classroom phone, the main phone line was dead too. She turned back to the door to go to the cafeteria and found Mike waiting for her. Listen, Mike, I need your help. I need all of you older students to watch the younger children who are scared. Mrs. Jackson, I'm scared, he said, looking up at her, his eyebrows and voice rising with his alarm. She smiled at him and continued. Mike, I have to go check the middle school wing. I need everyone to stay right here until I can get back. Can you do that? The boy looked at his feet and nodded. Yeah, will you be back soon? Mike, I'll be back as soon as possible. I will not leave you. She realized that the youngster was afraid she would not come back and would end up like the rest of the adults in the building, leaving them without someone to take care of them. Mike turned to walk back to the cafeteria, and Nancy took off at a jog toward the middle school wing. As soon as she pushed the doors open into the middle school wing, she ran to the office and grabbed the phone as she scanned the prone bodies of the office staff. Racing down the hallway, she found a group of 7th and 8th graders clinging to each other. She recognized 4 of the children from her class last year. A tall, thin, red-headed girl, Madeline, turned and threw herself into Nancy's arms. "Mrs. Jackson," Maddie cried. "Everyone has become zombies." Nancy patted the girl's back and gently pushed her away so she could speak to her face to face. "I know. So far, I'm the only adult that has not been affected by whatever this is." The 2 other girls started to cry, and Nancy reached out to the distraught girls. "Listen," she told them, sweeping her gaze around and making eye contact with each youngster, willing each to be calm. "I need your help. So far, you're the oldest students I've found that I can depend on to help me." Nancy watched the children to gauge their response to her request. She knew at least 3 of the students had been class leaders last year. They were good, solid, dependable youngsters who could be counted on to step up and take control. But that had been under normal classroom circumstances, and this was something completely out of the ordinary. All 5 of the young teenagers nodded solemnly, nervous tension etched on their faces. Nancy spoke calmly to them, trying to telegraph a confidence she herself did not feel. "I have all of the lower grade children in the elementary wing in the cafeteria." She watched the teens' faces and let that sink in. "I need you to go down and help my 6th graders watch the younger children while I check out the rest of the building for anyone else who can help. Can you do that?" she finished. All 5 of the teens silently nodded, indicating that they would help. Nancy smiled weakly at the children. "Okay, I want you all to go to the cafeteria and help take care of the younger children in that room until I get back. I need to hurry now, so go on. I'll be there as soon as I can." She watched their retreating backs and turned to enter the next classroom. Now, not only was a teacher in this frozen state, but the students were too. Many of the children were frozen at their stations, suspended in a gesture or staring at a blank computer screen. Nancy gave one last glance around the room and hurried to the next. She continued her sickening rush from room to room, finding the same scene in each one: frozen students and teachers, all immobilized, seemingly in whatever activity they had been engaged in at the moment this occurred. Nancy turned to walk into the last middle school classroom. Please, let me find at least one more adult for these children, for me." As she opened the door to the final 9th grade room, the scene that met her wrenched out the sob she had been holding in. She was so glad she had sent the children to the cafeteria. Everyone in this room was frozen too. "They're just babies, why?" she silently screamed. She shut the door and went on. Nancy tried to keep up her jog as she entered the high school wing. She opened the door to a science classroom, scanning around the room through tear-blurred eyes at the same scene. She shut the door in a robotic motion and systematically moved to the next room. The tears were now flowing freely down her face. There was not one unaffected child in the high school classrooms. Nancy paused, leaned on a wall for a moment, and considered not checking all the rooms in the high school portion of the campus, but decided someone had to at least witness what was happening. She worried constantly about the children in the cafeteria, and yet she was driven to go forward. She scrubbed the tears off her face with her sleeve and pushed open the door into the main office, finding the secretaries at their desks, frozen in place. She shut that door and continued down the hallway, trying to remember which way to go. She had come here for meetings 4 or 5 times a year and basically knew her way around. She swept her gaze up and down the hallway and saw students on the floor. They had been struck down during passing time between classes. She looked around and started to turn to leave the building when she heard a door slam. Nancy spun around toward the sound, calling out, "Hello, who's there?" At first there was only silence. Then, "Hey, where are you?" A lanky, sandy-haired teen came running around the far corner and stood there staring at Nancy. He raced down the hall, his face showing relief and panic. Are you a teacher?" he gasped, as he slid to a stop in front of her, his voice high with emotion. "I'm Mrs. Jackson from the elementary building." "What's your name?" she asked. forcing herself to sound as calm as she could. I'm Tim Nelson. Everyone is like zombies here. What's going on? He nearly shouted as his emotions found an adult outlet to communicate his terror. I was starting to think I was the last person alive. Everyone is like not dead, but they don't move. I can't get anyone to talk or respond. Nothing. We were going to B period, and everyone just stopped. Some dropped, some sort of twitched, and then fell. Hell, sorry. I thought I was in some gang flash spoof. I started to tell everyone the joke was old already and to get up, but they just lay there and wouldn't move. Nancy let him talk himself out. She recognized that he needed to release his pent-up panic and thought again about all the children back in the elementary building. At least now she had a semi-adult to help, and the existence of this healthy teenager eased a tiny mote of her own panic. She let Tim talk on until his voice started to level out. When she could hear him start to calm down a bit, she broke in. Listen, Tim, here's what I know. I'm the only adult so far that has not been affected. Whatever this is has not affected children under the age of 12. I've sent all the elementary children to the cafeteria while I've searched for others who are not affected. She paused and let that sink in. Have you seen or heard any other person in the building? No, he breathed. I've been running around looking in rooms, calling. The phones don't work, my cell's dead. The nurse, the secretaries, no one. Everyone is whatever that is. He pointed at the students lying in the hall. His volume had increased until he was nearly shouting again. Nancy needed to calm this kid down. She needed to lean on him heavily for help. Listen, Tim, there's over 180 children over at the elementary building, and you and I are the only adults. She elevated him to adult status, hoping to get him to step up, to get him ready to take on the responsibility she was about to force on him. He looked at her with that deer-in-the-headlights stare, and she could see him working through what she had just said, slowly dealing with the information. As Nancy watched, Tim's facial expressions went from panic to concern, and she started to realize just how lucky she was. She remembered Tim from 6th grade. He had been one of Diane's students, one of those amazingly good kids who would step up and do whatever he could to help. Mrs. Jackson, what about my parents? Tim asked. Nancy looked at the boy sympathetically. I don't know, Tim. I haven't been outside the building. She looked down the hallway. Here's what I need you to do. I need you to help me take care of those younger children while we try to figure out what is going on here. He took a deep breath and asked, Okay, what do you want me to do? She placed a hand on his shoulder. I need you to go over and be the adult in the room. I've been gone far too long, and I was ready to turn around and leave this building when I heard you slam that door down there. She pointed down the hallway. Tim nodded, looking less panicked. All right, he said. I'll go over and take care of the little kids. I need you to be calm and try to keep them calm. I left the 6th graders and a few 7th and 8th graders in charge of the younger children, so expect to walk into some form of chaos. I told some of the older children to find cookies, milk, whatever they could find, to give the little ones a snack and keep them busy. I'm sure they have finished doing that by now and are starting to feel alone and very anxious. I've been extremely nervous about getting back there and finding you as a lifesaver. She continued, I want you to go over there as fast as you can and take charge. Tell the children I'll be there soon. I must go through the building and be sure there is no one else like you or me. Can you do that? She looked Tim in the eye and saw him stand a little straighter. He just nodded and said, Okay. Thank you, she returned with a weak smile, when a thought came to her. Tim, do you have an implant? Tim looked surprised. Number. What's that have to do with this? Then it dawned on him. The whole net crashed, he whispered. Then his eyes went wide. Oh, wow. That means you don't have an implant either. Nancy gave her head a quick shake. No, mine are disconnected. The implications of what a total net crash could mean started to register in Nancy's mind. Go, she told Tim. I'll be there as soon as I can. You promise? He asked sheepishly. Nancy looked at him, seeing the fear of a little boy in his face. She put both hands on his shoulders and looked him in the eye. I promise. I will come straight over as soon as I see that there is no one else able to respond here." She forced a weak smile for him. "Go. I'm really worried about those little ones. They need an adult. Fast." He gave one more nod, then turned and started to run down the hallway and out the door. Nancy quickly walked and jogged through the building, stepping around the prone bodies on the floor, calling out and listening for any sound of any other person. She looked in each room, hoping for just one of those bodies to come to life, straining her ears to find one more person, anyone. But the building remained deathly silent. There should be the sounds of students laughing and talking as they passed from class to class, not this smothering, unnatural silence. With Tim gone to care for the children, she began to think beyond just the next few hours. How was she going to take care of all these children if this was real and went on for more than a few hours? What was going to happen to all the students and adults frozen motionless? If they did not come back to motion soon, how long could they live without food and water? The gravity of the situation flooded over her, and she stopped and swayed, gripping a door jamb, then started to cry. All these children and people would just lay here and die of starvation, and there was not a thing she could do about it. She had to take care of the lives she could take care of, and there would be nothing she could do for the victims. Victims of what? Anger flooded over her. Was this some super virus? Didn't that at least take time to develop? And didn't it affect mostly just a certain age group? The internet crash theory was starting to make even more sense. She let herself cry for a moment and released some of the fear and panic that had been threatening to overwhelm her. After a few final sniffs, she straightened up and quickly hurried on. She did not have time to mourn what she couldn't change. Maybe there would be help down the road. If she could get the children to the fire station down the road, they could get a 911 call out from there and get some help. And some damn pills for this damned headache. Nancy hurried back to the cafeteria, her panic about leaving the children alone decreasing with each step closer to the room. She had always been overly anal about her responsibility to her students, but this was one of those emergency situations that no one had trained her for. Hell, no one had been trained for this kind of situation. What the hell was actually happening? As she hurried down the hallway of the elementary wing, she glanced into the classrooms again as she passed each open door. There was still no change. She hurried on and started to hear the sound of children's voices. It sounded as if they were playing. The scene that met her as she entered the double doors to the cafeteria was of Tim orchestrating a game of Simon Says. Nancy wanted to cry. This kid was a treasure, and the younger children flocked to him like village children had followed the Pied Piper. She watched for a few minutes, letting the children enjoy this opportunity as long as they could, because when it started to sink in that their friends, and in some cases, siblings, were not going to join them, the tears would start to flow. Nancy needed to get help. She needed to find out what was going on. Maybe she could postpone the moment by getting a very early lunch. Maybe this bad dream will end. Tim looked up and waved. She gave him a wan smile and nod. Smiling was the last thing she felt like, but she had to put on a good front for the children. She needed to keep them calm as long as she could, until she could figure out her next move. She walked over to Tim and told him she wanted to walk down to the main office and see if there was any change, then assured him that she'd be right back. Tim nodded and went back to coaching the game. The children surrounded him with expressions of hero worship on their little faces. Nancy took a deep breath and walked down the hallway slowly, pushed the office door open, hoping to find things back to normal, but the scene had still not changed. She checked the phones and computers again. Still nothing. Okay, Nance, get over it. It is what it is, and you just need to deal. First, stall. Feed the children lunch. She looked at the clock. 10 o'clock. So they would have a very early lunch. That would kill another half hour or more. If nothing came up, she would walk the group to the fire station. What would she say when they started with their pleas for their mother, siblings, or to go home? She could only deal with one thing at a time, so she decided to wait for each dilemma to occur, then deal with it as it did. The fire station was about 2 miles down the road toward town. Nancy decided to tell the youngest children that they were going on a field trip to the fire station to see the fire trucks, and that's why they were having an early lunch. The older children would know that this was just a way to keep the smaller children calm, but she knew that this was just one more way to avoid dealing with the nightmare that was evolving around her, and that this was not an isolated situation. She feared that the truth would be that this was more widespread than just this one little country school. Nancy had Tim and the older children help organize the process of setting up some tables. She went into the kitchen and started to find something for lunch. She and Tim had to move the ladies who had been in the process of preparing the lunch for the day. As she and Tim picked up the first woman, Denise, the feel of the stiff vibration that ran through the woman's body nearly caused Nancy to drop her. They half carried and half dragged the three women to the staff room as gently as possible, and tried to prop them in chairs around the lunch table. "I wish we could take care of everyone somehow," Nancy said to Tim. "I don't see any way of doing that, Mrs. Jackson. Not with all those little kids to take care of. I was getting pretty nervous waiting for you to come back. I started to wonder what I would do if I had to take care of all of them. What if something happened to you and you went zombie on me?" Tim said, looking solemnly up at Nancy. "Tim, I told you and I mean it. I will not abandon you or those children. Not by my own choice. I cannot guarantee that whatever has happened to the other people won't happen to me. But as long as I have a choice, I will be right here with all of you. Understand?" She looked him straight in the eye to convey the absolute sincerity of her promise. The boy nodded, and Nancy put a comforting arm around his shoulders and gave him a reassuring pat. "You know, Tim, let's not call the victims zombies. They really aren't. For now, let's keep that quiet." They started to take an inventory of the foods available for lunch. They found some bread and sandwich ingredients, and the children helped themselves to more milk. During their impromptu lunch, the next situation Nancy had dreaded started. The lament of "Where's my brother or sister?" Soon it would be, "I want my mommy." Nancy put on her best everything is fine face and announced that they were having lunch early so the whole group could go to the fire station. The youngest of the students responded to this news with enthusiasm, and some of that excitement telegraphed through the group. Even some of the older children showed some interest, and for the time being, their worries were deflected from the unusual circumstances of the moment. Nancy asked him to walk down the hallway and shut the classroom doors so the youngest children would not see the other teachers or students still sitting or lying where they were when the event occurred. As soon as Tim returned, they all filed out of the cafeteria and down the hallway to the side door, then out onto the sidewalk that would lead them to the fire station. May 20th, impromptu field trip. As the group walked to the fire station, some of the youngest children skipped and played. The older children were more subdued and alternated between watching the smaller children or Tim and Nancy. Nancy let the children run and play. There were too many to control anyway. Plus, this might be the last moments of innocence they would ever get to enjoy. When they reached the fire station, Nancy told the children to wait on the lawn while she went inside to check with the firemen. But children being children, they pushed in around the door anyway. When Nancy stepped into the office, she found the firemen in the same frozen state as the teachers and staff. Nancy froze in panic, barely registering the sound of the few students who had followed her as they turned and shouted to others that the firemen were zombies too. This news quickly spread through the crowd. Nancy shook off the stunned shock of finding the firemen incapacitated and stepped back out to address the children. She tried to shout above the din, trying to get the children's attention, to get them to gather around her on the front lawn. But panic had started to spread. The news that the firemen were in the same condition as their teachers and other adults at school spread like wildfire through the whole group. Multiple clusters of children were picking up the lament that they wanted to go home. What about my parents? What about my brother or sister? As the wailing spread from group to group, the sound increased, building in volume until Nancy could not make herself heard above the roar of the frightened children. The combination of all the children's voices was reaching an overwhelming volume. Suddenly, a loud, piercing whistle blasted over the roar. Nancy spun around to see Tim standing on a chair, his fingers to his lips as a second loud whistle burst forth. "Listen up, everyone," he shouted at the sudden lull. "We need to listen to Mrs. Jackson." The group looked at Nancy pensively. Tim stepped down from the chair and offered Nancy his hand for her to step up onto the chair. She smiled gratefully to Tim. "Thank you," she breathed out in relief. Now that she had their attention again, she needed to calm them down, so she decided to discuss what was happening. Some of the children wanted to go home. Now the demands of "I want my mommy," or "my daddy," or "I want my family" threatened to build into a roar again. Nancy held her hands up to bring the group back to calm and quiet. "We have to stay together," she shouted. "The firemen aren't zombies. They are—" She paused to think. "They're frozen, like your teachers at school." She watched the children's faces, monitoring their responses. "We must stay together. You older students need to help me with the youngest children. None of us can take off without knowing whether or not help is out there." She waited for someone to argue with her. Thankfully, for once, no one contradicted her. "I'm going to try the phone in the fire station and find out if I can reach someone for help." She scanned the faces, then stepped down from the chair and walked back into the fire station. Nancy closed her eyes. Please let there be a tone. She picked up the phone and slowly brought the handset to her ear, but there was no tone, only the low, static hiss of a dead line. She put the handset back on the charging station and stared at the walls. Now what? Nancy took a deep breath, then turned to walk back outside. The children all looked to her for news. She looked back at the children and shook her head. "That phone's dead too," Nancy said to Tim. Nancy scanned the houses across the street. "I'm going to check some of the houses along the street. Maybe I can find another adult to help us." As she walked quickly toward the sidewalk, Nancy heard one little voice ask if the zombies would eat them. And the boy, AJ, spoke up saying, "Didn't you hear Mrs. Jackson? They aren't zombies. They're frozen, like veggies. They can't walk or talk or eat." Nancy mentally thanked AJ. He was always one of those students who would have their hand up offering to help. He was that child in your class that you'd affectionately labeled as a 35-year-old in a child's body. AJ's natural leadership was showing now as he stepped up to help calm the younger children down, with his bravado of pretending to know more than the others. The children huddled together on the front lawn of the fire station, watching Nancy expectantly. Nancy stopped and stood on the sidewalk, scanning the unnaturally quiet neighborhood across the street. She felt a shiver run up her spine. It was so very eerie how the absence of human noises allowed the natural noises to become a roar in her ears. The slightest breeze, the rustle of leaves as the breeze blew gently through the branches, seemed to be amplified. Nancy felt more than heard what she could only describe as a low-level roar. It was as if she could hear the air molecules colliding. The sound of silence was anything but silent. She looked back over her shoulder at the children as they waited silently for her. She hadn't noticed until now just how quiet it had suddenly become. Nancy realized she couldn't put reality off any longer and motioned the teenagers and Tim to come closer. "Okay," Nancy said. "Here is what we know. Tim and I are the only adults so far who are not frozen. We," and she looked over her little group of 12, 13, and a few 14-year-old children, meeting as many eyes as possible. "We are the only older people who have not been affected." She paused to let that piece of information settle in. "We have to take care of each other until we can find help or until everyone snaps out of whatever this is." A couple of the girls started to cry. Someone voiced concern about their family. Nancy spoke up in an attempt to stop the flood of rising panic. "All of us must take care of the younger children. They do not understand what is happening yet. As the oldest members of our group, we have a responsibility to be ready to keep the younger children calm and safe." Nancy carefully chose her words to include these older students as her partners. She needed them to step up and be the mature protectors. "Here's what we have to do. First, keep the youngest children calm. Play games. Keep them all together. No one can leave the group. We must stay together." One of the girls who had started to cry asked, "What about our parents?" I want to check my mom." Her tone had an edge of belligerence. She expected to get her way. Nancy looked directly at the girl and recalled her name. "Shelby, I'm sure that everyone here wants the same thing, and I would like nothing more than to have all of you go home to the safety of your families. But right now, we must stay together. I'm going to go around to some of the houses and try to find some help. For now, I want all of you to stay right here." She looked the girl in the eye until she looked away. This was a child who was very used to getting her way, and usually manipulated her parents to let her have whatever she wanted. "All of you stay here, and you older students help keep the younger children together." Nancy repeated this statement again. What was that old saying? 3 times is the charm, but with children, it was more like 3 times 3. The girl walked away with her friends. She was not happy, and Nancy could tell that she was plotting with her friends by the way she looked back over her shoulder angrily at Nancy. Nancy turned to Tim. "Stay here with the children and keep an eye on that one." She nodded toward the angry girl and her friends. "I'm going to knock on a few doors." Tim looked at her with concern on his face, and Nancy added, "I'll be right back. We're in this together. Recruit AJ and Mike to help you keep an eye on her and her little gang." Nancy indicated the girls again. Tim gave her a weak smile and a slight nod. He turned and walked over to the children, and he, Mike, AJ, and 3 of the older students started to organize games to distract the children. Nancy walked across the street to a white colonial house with a neat white picket fence. She pushed the gate open on its squeaky hinges and walked past the flowering azaleas along the slate path, leading to the hand-cut granite steps and up to the green front door. She knocked on the solid wooden door and waited. She listened in vain for the sound of someone walking across the floor to open the door. A call of, "I'm coming," or "Who's there?" She heard only that constant eerie silence. The hairs on her arms were standing up, and she had that gut-deep feeling that something very wrong was on the other side of this door. She reached out and turned the doorknob, then slowly opened the door. Nancy called out, "Hello, is anyone home?" She kept hoping there would be a normal answer from the back of the house, but there was still that suffocating silence. Nancy stepped into the hallway. It was typical of the homes in this area, with the old colonial stairway, the oxidized, varnished railing aged to deep, dark brown, and an oriental runner down the hall leading to a kitchen area in the back, the parlor to the right, and the dining area to the left. The wide old pine board floors dated the house to be an authentic colonial structure, and not some vintage replica. She had always loved these old money pits, but could never afford the upkeep of one by herself. 5 years ago, she and her husband had purchased an old colonial and had planned to raise a family there. But one day, she discovered that his plans had changed. She had been so happy before the divorce, so in love, and thought he was in love with her too. She shook her head. She had never seen it coming. She was so convinced that he had shared her dreams. They had worked so hard side by side to restore the old house they had bought, to turn it into a home in preparation for their future. But he betrayed her. She had believed in him, and he left her for another woman. If that wasn't enough, he got a lawyer that tried to cut her out of everything he could get. Nancy had to take the deal to split everything they had accrued. She knew she couldn't afford the old house on her teacher's paycheck, so she had taken the payoff and purchased a little house that she could afford and physically take care of. She had made a new life for herself and felt she was doing well. She examined the wide pine board running the length of the hallway and curled a rueful grin. She had heard through the gossip channels that his new wife had left him, took him to the cleaners, and had custody of the child. She guessed the final laugh was on him. He got his secretary, and she got the house. She hadn't thought about this sad, angry chapter of her life for a long time, and this definitely was not the time to waste thinking about her faithless ex. She shook it off. "Snap out of it, Nance. You have more important things to think about now." She walked back to the kitchen area and found what she feared. There was an older woman on the kitchen floor. She had obviously been preparing a meal, and the remnants of the meal were cast across the floor where it had been dropped mid-step. Spotting the phone, Nancy hurried over to check for a ringtone. Again, that aggravating static. Then Nancy looked for evidence of children but did not find any. She left the house and went to the next home, where she found a similar scene. After she had checked 4 more houses, she started back toward the fire station. As she was walking back past the 3rd house, she heard the cry of a baby. Nancy froze in mid-step. The cry sounded as if it came from the house behind these houses on the next street. Nancy looked into the backyards and could see that the yards were fenced off from each other, but 2 houses down she saw a gate between 2 of the homes. She turned and raced back down the street. She noticed Tim watching her from the fire station, and she waved to assure him that she had not forgotten him. She held up a forefinger, trying to signal to him, just one more, and hurried to get to the house with the back gate. Nancy crossed through the yards to the next street, then down this street to the house where she had heard the baby's cry. The cry got louder as she approached the house. Again, she knocked before she entered. This was the home of a mother, and she did not want to frighten the woman. But again, no answer, so she entered another house, without invitation. The baby's cry was louder and came from upstairs. Nancy called out to announce herself. She went to the kitchen first and found the mother on the floor, a baby bottle clutched in her hand, the milk dripping from the nipple into a small puddle on the linoleum. The woman's body was twitching. Nancy knelt, asking her, "Can you hear me? Can you respond?" But there was no response from the young mother. Nancy thought she must be in her mid-20s. Nancy gently pried the bottle from the young woman, murmuring, "I'll take care of your baby." Nancy did not know if the woman could hear her, but if she could, Nancy wanted to try to alleviate her fears. Nancy took the bottle and started up the stairs, following the sound of the baby's cries. In a nursery, she found a little girl standing in her crib, red-faced from crying. Nancy picked up the baby, cuddling her, and gave her the nipple. The baby hiccuped a few more sobs, and after a few hesitant sucks on the nipple, went to work chugging down the milk. Nancy smiled as the little girl looked up with those large infant eyes, her tears traveling down the sides of her reddened, chubby face. When the little girl finished the bottle, Nancy lifted the baby and laid her against her shoulder, patting her back. The resounding burp that issued from the child would have been unsurprising coming from a full-grown man. Nancy held the girl away and looked at her. My goodness, that wasn't ladylike. Nancy smiled at the child, then sniffed. Yep, her diaper needed to be changed too. Nancy found the baby's changing table and proceeded to change the diaper. Whoa, she thought. It was always horrifying how a cute little baby could smell so very bad. Having changed the diaper, she found a large diaper bag and collected as many supplies as she could stuff in the bag, then took the baby back downstairs and prepared another bottle. The formula that the mother had used was apparently from the empty carton on the counter. Nancy checked the cupboards and found 6 more cartons. She prepared another bottle for the baby. The baby's eyes were locked on her mother on the kitchen floor all the time that Nancy searched. She gathered up more supplies. She must get back to Tim and the other children, and she'd have to take the baby with her. She knelt and told the young woman on the floor again not to worry about her baby, that she would take care of her, and walked away.